Kia ora, I'm Amanda Gillies, and today on The Detail, dirty money and what the government is doing to clean up the problem.
I think it's important to acknowledge that New Zealand does have a money laundering problem. I think a lot of people think, little innocent, sweet New Zealand, we don't have bad things happen, but...
Just this March, an Auckland businessman was hauled before the courts after two unsuspecting Kiwis fell victim to a money laundering scam. They handed over their life savings.
An Auckland man has been found guilty of laundering almost $2 million obtained from two New Zealand victims of a term deposit scam.
$2 million is just the tip of the money laundering iceberg here, as expert Dave Saunders from RO Advisors told RNZ's 9 to Noon.
Probably the best estimates put the amount of money laundering that goes on in New Zealand at somewhere around $1.35 billion a year.
But New Zealand's anti-money laundering laws are tying up ordinary, innocent Kiwis in a tangle of onerous rules. They've been asked to jump through hoops to get anything done.
There is a lot of onus on the likes of ourselves to make sure that certain checks are done in line with the legislation. And that's largely driven by the supervisory body. So we've got the law, and then there's three supervisory bodies who sit above the law that say, hey, this is how we interpret the law, and you need to go and do some stuff.
Now, the government is promising changes to the anti-money laundering and countering financing of terrorism laws to seriously target criminals while cutting unnecessary red tape for law-abiding citizens.
Well, the whole point of the regime was to try and stop dirty money from flowing overseas. And we've put so much restraint on everyday Kiwis being able to go about their business without actually looking at whether or not we're following the dirty money.
That was Associate Justice Minister Nicole McKee at the launch of the changes last month. Her ACT leader, David Seymour, by her side.
In some areas, it's going to get tougher. And it's really, I think, about being more risk proportionate and more targeted. So there will be some stronger powers on truly bad activity, which helps satisfy our international arrangements.
But the changes, he says, are also about good old Kiwi common sense.
We're going to make sure that this area of bureaucracy, red tape and regulation, one of the most complained about and annoying there is fixed up so that people who want to open a bank account, set up a trust, buy or sell a house and just go through the stuff of life with their financial affairs can get it done and not be tied up in red tape and bureaucracy for no reason.
So today, The Detail looks at the anti-money laundering laws. Among the changes, which the government promises will be passed before the next election, police will have greater powers to freeze bank accounts more quickly, and there will be a ban on cryptocurrency ATMs. A more risk-based system for selling property from non-trading trusts, such as family trusts, will also be introduced, and it will finally be easier for parents to open bank accounts for their children.
I was saddened to see just this week a parent say that they went to open an account for their child and the bank said, don't bother, the AML bureaucracy makes it too hard to open a bank account in this country. If we can do one thing, if we care about financial literacy, it's make it easy for every child to have a bank account. Now, I don't remember having to prove my ID, my address, the nature of my financial relationship with my parents. And I don't think that Postbank were checking my transactions each week for any suspicious deposits or withdrawals.
But will this now make it easier for money launderers to set up kids' accounts for criminal purposes?
So when we look at whether or not bank accounts are being set up, it's hard to see whether or not there is money being laundered through children's bank accounts, but we have restrictions in place, such as $1,000 limits on transactions that are taking place. This means that we can't be using children's bank accounts to launder money.
So that was the ACT Party in full force at the launch. But now we'll hear from Lloyd Kavanagh, an internationally acclaimed financial services lawyer and dealmaker in Auckland. He'll talk through the changes, the pros and cons, who they will affect and if they will work. But I started by asking him to define money laundering.
Money laundering is the process by which people who've obtained money or funds as a result of a crime hide the origins of that money. And they typically undertake a number of processes to place it into the financial system in a way where its origins are not easily discerned. The other thing that goes on in the AML CFT regime is the financing of terrorism, which fortunately is much less of an issue in New Zealand, but still relevant. And that can be funds which come from a clean source, but which get sent to parts of the world to fund activities that we'd really much rather not see.
Do we know who the main offenders are? Who are the culprits nowadays?
Well, as a lawyer who's mostly involving financial institutions, I don't know the answer to that question. That's a question best directed at the Police Financial Intelligence Unit. But I do know from reports that they've issued that the kind of areas which are what we call predicate offences tend to be the drug trade. There's also fraud is another one. Tax evasion is another one where people are hiding the origins of the money that they've got.
When you say hide, how do they do that?
Well, I'm not an expert in hiding monies, but an example from Canada, I believe, was someone goes to a lawyer, says that they've got a dispute and are suing someone. The person that they're suing puts up a token resistance and then pays funds across from one to the other, which is rapidly settled with no big fight, and then the recipient of the funds is able to say, well, those were the proceeds of a damages claim that we settled and therefore have a legitimate source, and no one particularly looks into where the money came from. Other things that we hear about are people buying property and then selling it again, which, you look at where did someone get the money? Oh, they sold their house. Well, they're not asking the question of where did the funds come from to buy the house, pay the deposit and pay the mortgage payments as they were going. Other things that we've heard about is, people do things as basic as going to casinos or pokie machines and feeding money into them, and then when they have a win saying, well, those funds were the result of a win, rather than asking where did the money come from that enabled them to do that.
It's estimated a staggering $1.35 billion is generated from money laundering in New Zealand every year. So Lloyd welcomes changes to the law, and one measure in particular.
One of the things which the government has announced, which is underway and will take some time, is to unify our supervisors. So currently we have 3 supervisors who supervise different segments of the market. You have the Reserve Bank, who is the AML supervisor for banks. You have the FMA, who oversees securities markets participants broadly. And then you have the Department of Internal Affairs, who looks after casinos and everybody else. And everybody else includes lenders who don't take deposits. It includes lawyers, accountants, real estate agents, and quite a wide range of smaller businesses that don't fall under anyone else's oversight. And what the government is proposing is something that personally I've supported since the regime was first introduced, or the legislation was enacted back in 2009, which is that we should have a single supervisor so that they can be consistent in the guidance that they give to reporting entities and have a total overview of what's going on in the sector. So that's one measure which I do think will have a significant impact. Some of the other measures that are being engaged are actually to relieve the administrative burden. One of them is, at the moment, you have to verify your customer's address, which proves to be really difficult for a lot of people where the customer maybe doesn't own the property they live in, doesn't have their name on utility bills, is not otherwise in the banking system. Actually, it's only a small part of identifying who you're dealing with, and so the change will mean you only have to do that if you've got reasons for thinking that it's a high-risk customer.
Also making it easier, which seems to be very popular for parents. It's going to get easier to open a bank account for their children. Good news, but will this make it easier for money launderers to use the kids' bank account? Have you got any concerns about that?
There's always a risk, Amanda, but I think on balance it's the right move. Those children's accounts will still be subject to monitoring, and unusual transactions will still be detected and reported as under suspicious activity reports.
One of the things, Lloyd, was introducing a more risk-based system for selling property from non-trading trusts like family trusts and stuff. What does that actually mean?
At the moment, for reasons that are a little unclear to me, we've had since the outset a presumption that any trust should be subject to enhanced due diligence, which is the same standard that's applied to higher risk customers. Now, we all know that New Zealanders have a very high rate of trusts in our environment, one of the highest in the developed world, which range from treaty settlement trusts for iwi all the way down to a trust that someone might own their house in to protect it, in particularly if they're a self-employed tradie, in the event that their business goes bust. And to apply all of those to the same high standard means a lot of work for the reporting entities, which is not allowing them to spend their effort and time on the more deserving, higher risk customers, which they should focus on. So I think a very sensible move to adjust the framework to say, actually, if the customer is a trust, you approach it in the same way that you do for a company or indeed an individual, and undertake your risk assessment on that individual, decide what level of risk is apparent, and then that's the level at which you investigate who they are when you onboard them in the relationship. That's the part of AML, Amanda, that the public generally sees when they go to a bank, a new bank, or go to a real estate agent and they're asked for all this identity information. But actually, most of the work in the regime is done by the monitoring of transactions to identify those suspicious, what they call typologies, which mean that more questions should be asked. So I'm actually optimistic that by removing some of the mandatory bureaucracy, resources will get refocused in doing what I think, and I certainly hope, all New Zealanders are keen to do, which is to use the pressure on what happens to the proceeds of crime to help us detect crime in the first place.
From face-to-face with tellers, the trend now is to make deposits at ATMs to avoid interaction with staff.
And there'll be a ban on cryptocurrency ATMs. What's been the problem here?
I have to say I'm somewhat puzzled by that inclusion, because I haven't seen the evidence as to why that would be a particular priority. I mean, people fear cryptocurrency if they're not familiar with it, but certainly actually transactions on the blockchain are more traceable often than transactions through the traditional financial sector. So all that does is force or invite the bad actors to find another route, which might be, for example, transactions on the internet. So I think the key question is, are the same requirements being applied as are applied to other providers of financial services.
Greater powers have been given to police to freeze bank accounts more quickly. What's your take on this?
I'm a little reserved about simply giving additional powers to the police if you don't have the right checks and balances. But having said that, I think the thing that we do want to see from the police is greater use of the information that they do get. My understanding is that they receive some tens of thousands of suspicious activity reports, which doesn't necessarily mean there's anything wrong, but means there's a suspicion, to make sure that those are actually investigated and followed up, because it's where you get information and the authorities act really quickly that you get the best impact.
He says in Australia, police caught a major money launderer by quickly jumping on suspicious activity,
which enabled them to apprehend gangs that were selling drugs and laundering the proceeds, because they acted within a day or two of suspicious behaviour of someone going around Perth opening multiple bank accounts when they had no reason apparently to be doing that. And I do wonder sometimes whether we are fast enough.
Do you feel we've been a bit maybe too soft, maybe legally speaking, or, hands held behind our backs in the past, which has stopped us getting onto it earlier?
I think it's more about the resourcing that's required to move quickly. So given the volume of reports that I've talked about, that involves significant investment in technology and software to detect patterns and allocate resource. And I think rather than our enforcement once people are engaged being too soft, it's that we, as is often the case in New Zealand, we write great laws and then don't resource the agencies who are charged with giving effect to them.
Do you think these law changes, great laws, do you think they go far enough, Lloyd? Will they actually make a difference?
I think they will. I think they're generally a step in the right direction, and it's really a process of continuing to be involved in monitoring how things play out. This package of legislative changes has been a long time coming. The regime was enacted in 2009, came into force in 2013. There were then what they call phase 2, which was adding lawyers, accountants and real estate agents and a few others to the regime in 2017. Then we had the international body that checks how countries are doing come to us in New Zealand. They're called FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, in 2019, 2020. And then following their visit, the government produced a report, 2021. Here we are in 2025, still rolling out, and all credit again to Minister McKee, who's really leant into trying to get this stuff done. It's only now that we're doing things. The question will be whether we keep that momentum.
Lloyd just mentioned phase 2. Business advisor Dave Saunders was involved in that phase and last week told RNZ he put a lot of time and energy into it, attending multiple seminars, undergoing training and speaking to lawyers and financial specialists.
At the end of all of that activity, and we probably spent nearly 6 months full time on this. At the end of all of that activity, I actually learned more about spotting money laundering from watching Ozark than I did from any of the presentations. And I guess if I went fundamentally, what would I like to see changed? I think it'd be really, really useful if rather than going, here's all these things you need to do, and if you get it wrong, we'll smack you over the backside, if we actually went, well, how do we spot money laundering? What are the current trends that money launderers are using? And if you've got an accountant in public practice, or if you're a law firm or something like that, what would we really like you to be looking out for? Not just in your clients that you have to do this for, but across the board. Because I do think that again, most of the accountants or lawyers that I speak to, they'd like to see money laundering stop.
So I think that is a very fair point. Personally, I enjoyed watching Ozark, a great fan of an entertaining show. But I do think, again, this is about the institutional dynamic. I'm hopeful that with a single AML supervisor, they will lean into explaining to New Zealanders what it is that they should be looking out for and what types of transactions. And these change all the time, right? You know, it's not like there's a static set of things you can do. You've got organised crime, which is a business, which is innovating and trying to come up with new methods. But what we've really lacked in New Zealand is a government agency that is speaking to the general population. And going right back to 2013, when the regime came in, I was one of those that really was calling for and saying I was disappointed that the government then didn't educate the general population to explain why they were suddenly being asked for proof of identity when they never had in the past. And so people typically blamed the business that wouldn't onboard them because they didn't bring their driver's license and a utility bill on the day that they wanted to engage, instead of government doing what it has done for other initiatives in the past, which is explain that they are making a change and why this is beneficial to all of us. Because let's be clear here, Amanda, we all benefit if there's less crime in New Zealand, if it is more of the country that we might remember from years ago, where you didn't have the levels of break-ins, of substance abuse, and all of those things that affect large numbers of people in their everyday life. And, you know, the old saying, follow the money, is exactly what the anti-money laundering regime is supposed to be about. But someone has to tell people, small business people, what is it that they should be identifying and reporting if they need.
Do you think, honestly, those who launder money will care about these law reforms? Where there's a will, there's a way, and they'll just take another detour to do what they want to do?
You're asking me to step into the minds of people that I don't know, Amanda.
Fair.
But I imagine that at the margin, these people make business decisions as to which countries are easier to operate in and profitable to operate in. And we know from the reports that have come from government over the last year that New Zealand has an increasing level of drug abuse. We know that we are more and more connected into a world where there are all sorts of transactions going on. And so what we need to do is just make ourselves a little bit harder to do bad things in. It's a little bit like that advice we always receive about locking our homes. It doesn't fully protect us. It might mean that it's a bit more difficult and we delay or defer, or the bad actor goes somewhere else.
That's all for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Thank you to Lloyd Kavanagh. This episode was produced by Alexia Russell and engineered by Phil Benj. I'm Amanda Gillies. Matua.